Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Bank of Canada Museum's virtual speaker event towards a digital Canadian dollar. Welcome, everyone. I hope you've been able to figure out the team's event. My name is Nicholas Galetti. I'm the Senior Director of Communications here at the Bank of Canada. It's my pleasure to host tonight's event. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We pay our respect to Indigenous peoples across our country and to their ancestors for their immeasurable contributions to Canada. Before we begin, we'd like to go over a couple of the technological considerations for you tonight so you can participate in tonight's event. We've got a fascinating presentation by two really passionate and knowledgeable speakers, but before I introduce them, the one thing we're going to do is we're going to ask your opinion at a couple of points throughout the presentation. So if you go to the Q&A icon, whenever you have a comment or a question, it's at the top. It's the little bubbles with the question mark. You can just click on that and type in your question or comment on other people's questions, and we'll have a poll for you as well later. And you can also select to ask anonymously your question if you'd prefer. So our moderators will be in the background looking at these questions, and we'll be putting them forward to our speakers at the Q&A portion of the event. Not to worry, we'll go over some of these instructions again before when we get underway. And so before we begin, let me introduce our speakers. Really happy to welcome our Director of FinTech Research, Dinesh Shah, who's, there's Dinesh. He leads our technology group at the Bank of Canada, doing research on FinTech and e-money. So very interesting to hear his perspective tonight. His work includes analyzing emerging and potentially disruptive technologies for the financial system. Prior to joining the bank in 2019, Dinesh was a co-founder and architect at various startups. He spent 8 years as a developer of various fixed income trading and risk management systems at financial institutions in London. In addition, he provided expertise on the application of leading edge technologies to securities trading and clearing firms. Dinesh has a Bachelor of Science degree in physics with computing from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Dinesh. Joining Dinesh tonight is Stephanie Richardson. Stephanie's our Director of Stakeholder Relations Initiatives in our Communications Department. Stephanie leads a team of engagement and outreach specialists who work at strengthening the bank's relationships with existing stakeholders and finding opportunities to reach out to those who we do not traditionally hear from. Stephanie has extensive expertise and experience in communications and outreach, and has worked in a number of different federal departments in the National Capital Region. Stephanie has a Bachelor of Journalism and History from Carleton University. So over to you, Stephanie and Dinesh, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks so much to everybody online for participating in our virtual speakers event. Tonight we're going to take a trip into the future, and we're going to consider what a digital Canadian dollar might look like, as well as looking at what Canadians might want to have a digital dollar. So let me just move to the next slide here. Sorry, hold on one second. There we go. So let's start our discussion about the future of money by going back in time. Through history, money has had many forms and played many different roles. It's been used as a record of value, as a way to agree on prices, and as a facilitator of trade. And here are some early examples. On the left, here you'll see a tea brick. These were used as currency in several parts of Central Asia from the 9th to the 20th century. Tea became a popular item to trade with the Russian nobility demanding Chinese tea. Initially, dried tea leaves were shipped along the Silk Route. However, over time, people found it more convenient to process the tea and form it into solid book-sized bricks. Eventually, these tea bricks became an accepted medium of currency that could be used as easily as silver and other trade items. On the right, you'll see cowrie shells. These were one of the most common forms of currency in Africa, Europe, and Asia. In China and Japan, they were used for almost 1,500 years. Cowries were so important in China that they inspired the shape of the Chinese character that means to buy. So now let's talk about the first blockchain. Here you'll see what's called a RAI, or a yapstone. And once we can visit again in person, you can see this yapstone and other forms of currency at the Bank of Canada Museum in Ottawa. The island of Yap is a tiny island in Micronesia, located in the Pacific Ocean due east of the Philippines. They created a truly unique form of currency, whereby they would travel 400 kilometers to another island chain to quarry large discs of limestone. They would then ferry this stone money back over rough seas. This difficult journey, combined with their size, weight, and fragility, made them valuable. Just to give you an idea, the yapstone we have in the museum that you can see on this image in front of you is over 7 feet tall and weighs 4,000 pounds. What's interesting about the RAI is that they rarely physically changed hands. They were very hard to move, so they generally stayed in one place. Their ownership was tracked through an oral ledger, a community consensus of ownership that ensured transparency and security. This is a great example of our past influencing our future because the yapstone can be considered the earliest system of what underpins cryptocurrencies today that rely on blockchain technology. Blockchain technology are digital ledgers that track financial transactions in cryptocurrencies across a computer network. In fact, the RAI shares other characteristics with modern blockchain-based cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Just like the RAI, the Bitcoin is rarely used to buy and sell goods and services. It's just not very convenient. Instead, it's mainly used as an investment to hold value. But other kinds of digital money are becoming more and more important in our economy. And now we're going to start with your input in the first of our 2 audience polls tonight. The form money has taken has changed over time, as today we're not trading tea bricks or cowrie shells or even gigantic yapstones. Today we already have digital forms of payment. So let's take some time now to think about how we've all used electronic money instead of banknotes or coins or cowrie shells and tea bricks. I'm thinking of things like e-transfer, credit and debit cards, and Interac Tap. And when you use these digital forms of payment, what did you actually like about them? So for the polling tonight, if you go into the chat function of our event, you'll be able to input your response. You'll be able to see what your fellow participants are responding and be able to vote by liking an item on the list. So we've listed a few items, or we will be listing a few items in the chat. If there are different kinds of payments or features that we've missed, you can add them into the chat now as well. So while we're giving everybody a little bit of time to see the poll and answer some of the questions, I'm going to ask a question to Dinesh. So Dinesh, what do you have in your wallet? What forms of payment do you use?
Oh, let's see. Stephanie, yeah, I've got a few things. I do have a note. I tend to carry a 50 around, a few cards, a bunch of credit cards, and debit cards. And oh, actually, the kids are actually watching, but I've got a small notes, 5s and 10s, for the kids. Because the younger one doesn't have any kind of a card, so that I definitely need for when I need to give a small amount of money to the kids. But I think it's fair to say that I use credit and debit cards probably for most of my purchases now. How about you?
Probably about the same, though I have found at various points during the pandemic I had a little bit less cash on hand than I had normally used, but now that everything's opening up again, I think it'll go back to kind of those pre-pandemic levels. So the other thing that's kind of interesting is we've done some surveys, cash use surveys from the Bank of Canada, conducted in probably April and July this year. And I think my experience is really reflected in the response that we got from Canadians. On average, they, basically hold about $70 worth of cash on them, in addition to bank cards, debit, credit cards, and more than half of them use debit cards on a regular basis. So while the electronic methods really continue to probably dominate our payment sphere, people still use a lot of cash, and that, majority of Canadians have actually also told us that they have no plans to go cashless over the next 5 years. So people will keep on having banknotes and coins in their wallets.
Yeah, that's a good segue, Stephanie. I think we've got a number of results that I can flag for you today. It seems that plastic, credit card and debit card seems to be the most popular form of payment. People are still using cash though, so we've got 10 people have voted for cash, but a good 20 people, 21 now, have said that credit cards are their preferred method of payment. But we have a number of people putting in other forms of payment, like PayPal or digital wallets for their favorite coffee shop, like Starbucks and Tim Hortons. Interestingly, only one person has said that they use private cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. So that's not surprising, I don't think. Right, Dinesh?
No, not really. That's pretty much in keeping, I think, with what we've seen in kind of small, and actually large surveys. So yeah, I think predominantly people are using debit and credit cards. Still a very sizable proportion, like third to half, still using cash, and very small number using cryptocurrencies. I think I've used, just as part of my research, a cryptocurrency transaction just once to actually buy a book on Bitcoin. So yeah, it seems pretty much in keeping. Actually, not altogether surprising. Yeah.
So I'm assuming, Nick, that we're also getting some comments about some of the features about what people liked, what kind of things that they like about the payment systems that they're using.
Yes, so we have one comment saying that the convenience of digital payments is one of their most important feature. But I'm going to put in a couple of other features. And if you can vote on these as well, that would be great. So convenience is definitely one.
So in 2019, we actually at the Bank of Canada held some focus groups in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, where we talked about digital currency, central bank digital currency. And we asked exactly this question, and some of the advantages that the participants in the focus groups raised were things like ease of use, safety, speed, but they also talked about some of the disadvantages too, about whether there would be fees or concerns about privacy or technical issues about some of the electronic methods of payment. So those are kind of interesting ones, as well as some of the examples they also talked about were things like loyalty points. People are really big fans of credit cards that can have points where you can use towards groceries or other benefits, or even travel when we can finally travel again, collecting up those travel points on your credit cards.
Yeah, and with convenience in particular, I think many people may have remembered when Tap and Pay came along. There was really quite a dramatic shift, right, in adopting that. We went from, I guess, transactions that took, which doesn't seem very long, maybe something like 10 seconds to put your card in and then tap in a PIN, to being able to just do something in, about a second, I guess, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and then just walk away. And even that change of a few seconds really makes a dramatic difference, right, to people's preferences for payment. So it's quite amazing how much convenience really matters to people.
Yeah, so we are seeing some people voting now, and convenience definitely is the number one feature that people like, but speed and the fact that it's accepted everywhere is also very high on the list. you know, one of our participants talked about the fact that during the pandemic, it became a more safe or or sanitary way of paying, and so that's also I think the pandemic has certainly had an impact on how people pay. But we've noticed, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Stephanie, that people still used cash during the pandemic, even with some of the earlier concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anyone's interested, you can always check out our cash use studies on our website. But Nick, you're exactly right that cash use continued during the pandemic, and we're definitely getting back to the pre-pandemic levels as of probably about April this year. So it's not going away.
And loyalty points, reward points is another key feature that people are saying is very important for them. So we've got someone put that in the chat, and got 7 votes for that already.
That's a big one.
Yeah, and if you think about it globally, it's a very North American phenomenon, actually. You know, when you speak to our friends in Europe and so on, this kind of loyalty and cashback and so on. Isn't that common, actually, outside of the US and Canada? So it's quite interesting, actually, to see people's payment behaviors in different countries because of things like this.
All right, well, I think that moves us on our first poll for the evening. And now I guess we'll toss it over to you, Dinesh, and you can talk to us a little bit about the work that we're doing on digital currency and what this means.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. So now, you know, when we talk about central bank digital currencies, sometimes it's not clear exactly what we mean by that, and that's understandable because while, in fact, most central banks around the world are studying it, including Canada, of course, there hasn't been a huge number of countries who have actually released a national digital currency. And different countries have different ideas about the design and the motivation or the purpose of the digital currencies. But in the simplest terms, when the Bank of Canada speaks about central bank digital currencies, what we think of is something that's designed to provide many of the same benefits as cash. So they're a safe way to pay for things. They're accessible to everyone, what we call universally accessible. They're a private way to buy goods and services, not anonymous, but very private. And they're durable. They're very, very resilient. So they would really be the same and have the same value as the polymer banknotes that we just spoke about, that we all tend to use. But the digital dollar, of course, would be electronic. It could be used for online transactions or at the point of sale using perhaps a mobile phone or a card of some kind, or even another kind of a device. So just wait for my slide to change here. Okay, so now you might be wondering, you know, why are we even thinking about a digital dollar? Well, there've been a lot of changes in recent years to how we pay for things, as we just noted. And in Canada, like many other countries around the world, we are seeing a declining use of cash to buy goods and services. Back in 2017, the Bank of Canada asked Canadians how they pay for goods and services. So at that time, people said they used cash for approximately 1/3 of their transactions, and that compares with more than half just a decade ago. And in fact, 1 in 10 Canadians who were asked said that they are now entirely cashless. And we're also seeing more online and digital payments in the form of debit, credit, and prepaid cards, as well as mobile payment methods like Apple Pay and Google Pay. And of course, we also have the ability to send money to one another through e-transfers directly from our bank accounts. Now, currency is a core part of the bank's mandate. So it's part of our job to look at if and how we could have digital currency alongside our polymer banknotes. And if the public does want a digital cash-like currency, there are some good reasons that illustrate why a central bank, which is a trusted public institution, should be the one issuing it. Only a central bank can guarantee complete safety and universal access credibly. That means, to the entire population. And only a central bank can ensure that it's the public interest and not profits that are the top priority. So providing a safe, private, trustworthy, and durable, resilient currency, whether that's a banknote or a digital currency, is a public good that we could all benefit from. So another part of the Bank of Canada's mandate is to ensure that Canadians can always pay for things how they want to, with trust and confidence. It's our responsibility to be prepared for changes, even if they seem quite far off over the horizon, like a central bank digital currency. So the bank has conducted extensive research and analysis on a possible digital dollar, and what it is that might prompt us to seriously consider issuing one. One scenario could be that if we ever reach a tipping point where most Canadians just stop using cash. We did see some hesitation during the pandemic to use banknotes, but overall the demand for cash still remains strong. There's a second, more challenging scenario that could lead us to consider issuing a digital dollar, and that's if there's widespread use of private digital currencies like Bitcoins or stablecoins that are not denominated in Canadian dollars. And despite the claim of being the money of the future, current private digital currencies like Bitcoin, but others, don't really work well for making payments or saving for the future because of their fluctuating values and slow clearing and settlement times. Very few merchants accept them. Private digital currencies also carry some important risks to both the economy and the financial system as a whole. There's always the possibility that the issuing company could go out of business or fall victim to cyber theft. And it's also concerning to think about a private company having control over even more of our data. But even if both of these, either both of these scenarios that I laid out presented themselves, that would not mean that this automatically trips some kind of switch to us producing a Canadian digital dollar. Canadians and their elected representatives would have to make a conscious decision that this is what they want and need. Now, I want to stress that our overall goal is not to replace banknotes or bank deposits. Most Canadians still rely on our banknotes, and we will continue to build and improve upon the innovations you see today in the banknotes, like the internationally recognized security features on our banknotes. We're also working behind the scenes to improve the payment system that supports the transactions that we carry out every day. Canadians may take our current payment system for granted, which is a good thing, because buying goods and services is already relatively straightforward and simple. And long gone are the days when making a large impulse payment over a weekend was next to impossible simply because your bank wasn't open for you to withdraw cash. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities to provide greater choice and improvements in how we pay for goods and services. And at the same time, the bank will keep exploring the possibilities of a digital currency, and that would be an electronic version of banknotes that we all trust and rely on. but we will issue a digital dollar only if and when the time is right, with the support of Canadians and the federal government, and with the best evidence in hand. Now, this evidence gathering includes looking at how we could make a digital dollar an attractive option to use when making a purchase, considering the best design, so it's accessible to everyone, that is reliable, secure, and private. Okay, now that we've spoken about why a digital dollar may be beneficial to Canadians, we'd actually like to hear from you again on what it is that would make a digital dollar attractive to you. Again, the same method. If you now go to our Q&A, and I think Nick will post up some options, and you can like those, and we'll see what kind of result we get.
So, as Nick.
Sorry, I was going to just say we had a couple of questions come in. So while we're waiting for the votes to come in, Dinesh, one question on CBDC. Can we get loans from central bank directly to CBDC accounts?
Oh, that's a great question. So the straightforward answer is no, right? You really should think of CBDC as being very similar to a banknote. So the whole idea is to provide a very high quality payment instrument in a digital form that you can use online and so on, the way you can't with cash. It absolutely is not about trying to provide banking services like loans, for example. So many of the things that a commercial bank would do are just not on the table for a CBDC. So it really is about providing a first-rate payment instrument with some of the qualities that I had mentioned before. That's a great question.
Okay, it looks like we're getting a number of responses in.
Okay.
And so far, it sounds like accessibility and security are the two features that are most desired by our participants tonight. Although reliability and privacy are also important, reliability more than privacy. But it's interesting. I think all of these features seem to be important to people.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. So, I'll expand just a little bit more, right, on accessibility, right, because it has a couple of different dimensions, what we call universal access. So on the one hand, of course, it should be available to everyone. And I mentioned earlier that, I have one kid who is not old enough yet to have a card and so on. So it relies on cash. And of course, for him, it's hard to make online purchases, and he would come to us. So there's accessibility in terms of all age groups and so on, even young kids. But we're also taking very seriously this idea of making sure that a CBDC is accessible to people with impairments, such as cognitive impairments, sensory and motor impairments, right? So these are quite difficult design issues. But it's really at the heart of our thinking about universal access to make sure this is truly accessible to everyone in Canada.
Okay, thank you, Dinesh. I think, and thank you, Stephanie. That was an amazing presentation. Lots of really great information there, and I think we're getting questions are coming in like wildfire. So why don't we move straight to the Q&A period, and I'll start it off with a question about privacy. So will a central bank digital currency be anonymous in the same way as cryptocurrencies?
I'll take that one, Nick.
So go ahead.
Yeah, again, in a word, no. The most obvious reason for that, and in fact, we found this in a focus group that we small focus group undertook actually 2 years ago, and I think in 3 different cities, where it was interesting because on the one hand, people did want privacy, but they also said they see the downside of anonymity because, of course, there's an element of an anonymous money being used for illicit purposes. Let me just put it that way. But of course, the bank, just like any other institution, regulated institution, has to comply with laws, right? And that includes complying with anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing laws, and so on. So while we aim to make the CBDC extremely private and demonstrate that it is extremely private, we also have to be compliant with these laws. So, for example, very large transactions, as in the current AML, anti-money laundering regulations, do have to be reported to FINTRAC, and that's the case. And CBDC will be no exception, right? So in those cases, so although it wouldn't be anonymous, it will be highly private, and there's a lot of research we're doing actually to make sure that it's truly private. And when there is the need for this compliance, that it follows due process, and that due process is very transparent and understandable, so that Canadians can have confidence, right, in the privacy mechanisms that we'll build in.
Thank you, Dinesh. Next question: would private banks that currently have access to central bank accounts be opposed to universal individual accounts in a CBDC?
So that we don't have a completely clear picture of right now. That'll take conversations with commercial banks. I think if you look at some of the literature, there is some discussion around, well, does this mean that bank deposits might be reduced? In other words, the amount of money in bank accounts to CBDC. It's not clear exactly how that would play out, and what the extent of that be, what the extent of that would be, and what the implications of that would be. So that's also another area of quite important research that we're undertaking.
Excellent, thank you. So next question: is there any work being done on having a common North American digital currency?
If by that people mean literally what any economists call the unit of account, meaning a US dollar or a Canadian dollar, so having one of these units of account, no. I mean that's that's such a fundamental change to the sovereignty of the state. So absolutely not. And in fact, we have a list of public policy goals. And in fact, one of those policy goals is to protect the monetary sovereignty of Canada. In other words, that the Canadian dollar should remain the unit of choice for Canadians making their purchases and their savings and so on. And the reason for that is if a non-Canadian dollar money makes major inroads into the Canadian economy, it means the Bank of Canada's ability to conduct monetary policy is that much harder, if not impossible. And of course, that's key to keeping inflation low and stable.
Thank you, Dinesh. Maybe I'll just add to that, though. The bank is working very closely with other central banks around the world on all of this research, because there is quite a lot we can learn from other countries about their approach to this topic. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one of the nice things about central banks is that because we don't have a commercial competitive interest, there's more and more cooperation and collaboration, and a lot of sharing of ideas and so on that's going on, and it's actually only growing as more and more countries start looking at central bank digital currencies.
Thank you. Now, the next question is one we get quite often, and I know in talking with my family and friends, it's one that comes up quite often. What's the difference between a CBDC and the digital money in your bank account now?
Okay, so the most fundamental reason is that money is, I was just about to say always, but typically, and I'll explain why in a second, a claim on some kind of entity, right? So the dollar bills you have are a claim on the central bank, right? So the central bank is the issuer, and it's a claim on the central bank. The money you have in your commercial bank account is a claim on that commercial bank, right? So we often don't see this, and most Canadians don't even think about it, and that's that's kind of a good thing, right? Because this idea of singleness of money, right? We can transfer money to one another from our bank account in one firm to another, take out cash, and all exchanges one for one. There was a time when that didn't actually happen. So that's a great thing. It makes life easier, but fundamentally, foundationally, it's actually kind of different monies because they're a claim on different institutions. A CBDC would be a claim on the central bank in exactly the same way that a dollar bill, a $10 bill, is a claim on the central bank. And that's one of the reasons why when we speak about these central bank money, whether it's a banknote or a CBDC, being safe, that's what we mean, because a central bank, by definition, can't go bust, right? So in that sense, we have that level of safety.
Thank you, Dinesh. I think building on this, there's another question along these lines. How easily would it be to transfer funds in a CBDC account to or from other methods, such as a traditional bank account or just regular cash?
Yeah, they're that's good. I will tell you, put into two things, right? One is what the intent is and what the design is, right? So in terms of the intent, we want that. We want that fluidity, right, where people can move money very easily from one type of money to another. I think Canadians expect that. I think they would want that, and we have to design for that, right? So in the work we do, we think about this as the interoperability question, right? How systems can interoperate, how easy it is to, even in the physical form, where do you go to if you want to exchange your $20 bill for CBDC? We want to make that as easy and convenient as possible. Now, that's a question that needs a lot of work to think about, what that sort of ecosystem looks like, that, where do you go to exchange these notes and so on. But we certainly want to work hard to make sure that that's very easy to do both ways, right? Just to make people's life easy and meet their expectations. It's, the easiest way to think about commercial bank money, of course, is the same way in which we transfer money from one person to another, from one bank to another, right? That's something that could happen. In the physical world, with banknotes, it's probably a little trickier because then probably needs to be some kind of infrastructure, whether it's going to a commercial bank or going to some new kind of agent that people could just find conveniently somewhere to allow them to do that. But it's another one of those design questions. Oh,
Mute, Nikki.
I'm muted. Now I'm unmuted. It had to happen once tonight, I know. So the question is, would CBDCs pay interest, or would there be travel points for using CBDCs?
Okay, maybe this is the saddest part of the evening. So no, there won't be travel points, and there won't be interest, because we're back to this cash likeness. That's fundamentally what it is, right? It's this cash-like instrument that's made for payments. Although we might like cashback and travel points and so on, that's not on the card. So sorry to disappoint folks.
Okay, we have two questions that I'll ask them together because I think they're quite connected. So how do you use a CBDC without access to a phone or a computer or even Wi-Fi? And would a digital dollar only be usable electronically, or would there be a physical debit card equivalent?
Yeah, so part of the motivation around this question actually is around universal access, right? Because in fact, most Canadians do have smartphones, but not everyone, right? So there's one very obvious category of people are young children, but in fact, there are many adults, right, who still don't. And Canada being, such a large landmass, there are communities that aren't very well served by cellular telephony, right? So, where there isn't either there's poor or actually no cellular network still. Of course, that's improving in Canada as it is around the world all the time, but we're still not there yet. So when we think about universal access, well, what do we do here, right, in these cases? So we are working with the idea of some kind of dedicated device, in fact, what we call a universal access device, right? But it's kind of the idea is some kind of custom device. There's lots of different forms of this, right? It could be as simple as a card, which is exactly, the same or familiar, very familiar as your credit and debit cards, but it's a stored value card, and an extremely secure form of a stored value card that would allow you to make transactions, possibly from one card directly to another. That's actually a very, very tough a security question, right? How we do that in a way that's secure, it's very difficult. But that's one idea. But there may be others, right? We may imagine in the future that we would have not a passive card as most of our debit and credit cards are, but something that's similar, but is active. In other words, you could actually type on, and there are some of these things out there experimentally where you can kind of type a number right into a card and then transfer that value to someone else who has either a card or a phone. So these things are a little bit over the horizon, but we are looking at these. And there's the other factor there, which is resilience. Even if people do have phones, we do occasionally have network outages, and fair enough, they're not very common. But in government, you often think about not things that might happen once every couple of years, but once in a decade event. And if we have outages for a long time, it could be that we could design a CBDC that allow people to continue their economic lives, even without networks or even power for a little while. It's a tough problem, but something we're working on.
Okay, we've got way many more questions than we can probably get to tonight, but I'll ask maybe one or two more, and then we'll wrap it up. So, would all businesses accept CBDC from day one, or would it be hard to use at first?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, we don't expect any kind of, I think it's quite rare, but in some countries where people, merchants are compelled to accept, for example, cash. I think there are some countries where merchants have to accept cash. We don't have that in Canada, and I would anticipate that wouldn't be that would be the same for CBDC, right? So it would be a choice. It would be a choice for merchants, and I guess this is what economists would call the network problem, right? Of two-sided markets, right? Where you need both, right? You need merchants and you need consumers, and it's a little bit of chicken and egg problem, right? Which is how do you start this whole thing going? Do you first have consumers who want to use this, who demand it of merchants, or is it that merchants want this and somehow demand it of consumers? We're not quite sure, but we would have to do the work in making sure that this value proposition for both users and merchants coincides. And it's again one of those tricky problems that really all businesses have to deal with whenever they're building any kind of new product, right? There is this problem. So it's certainly not unique to a central bank digital currency, but it's something that we would absolutely have to figure out.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more. You don't carry all your cash around that you have, but how would you implement this with a CBDC in terms of security? If you, let's say, lost your card or your device or something.
Yeah, so much of that depends on the design. Right now, in fact, I can link it back to when we spoke about these offline transactions, right, from one device directly to another. If we didn't have that, right? So effectively, every time you made a transaction, it was always assuming that the internet was available, right? It was always on. That makes things a lot easier in terms of recovery, right? So, for example, right, as we do with our bank accounts, if I lost my phone, right, I had CBDC, I lost my phone. Well, I mean, the easiest way to think about that is I get my new phone, I download the app or whatever it is, and I log in, and magically my money appears again, right? Because there's some kind of register that's available on the internet, whatever shape or form it is, that actually knows how much money I had, right? What my holdings were. But sometimes one design option for the offline case, right, is to actually have the money not so much sitting on a computer somewhere on the internet, but in a sense, much like cash, actually on the device, whether that's a phone or whether that's one of these custom devices that I mentioned. In that case, there's a little bit of a problem. It's much harder because if there's no record of that money anywhere else in the system, and you lose it, you lose your phone or you lose your card or whatever it is, then it's very difficult to make a claim, right? And to say, well, look, I had $100 on this thing, right? When in fact, perhaps you didn't. So it's a difficult problem, and it could be that we have sort of two types of holdings, and I say this is very preliminary. I do stress that, right? Just conceptual thinking about this. That, well, perhaps there is a small amount of money that you could hold, just for that kind of need, for the occasional offline transactions. And if you lose it, you lose it, and it will be very much like cash. And of course, you would make sure that you don't put a large amount of money in, if you like, in that sort of pot, right? And you treat it very much like cash. But again, this is ongoing research.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze one in. Hopefully, maybe Dinesh, you can give us a short answer to this one.
Sure.
What determines the value of a CBDC? Would it fluctuate like the Canadian dollar?
It would fluctuate like the Canadian dollar, right? Because it is a Canadian dollar, right? It is exactly the same as a banknote. Banknotes. Okay, you said keep it short, right? So there's some kind of asset backing a banknote, right? Typically, government treasuries that banks did deposit with us. It will be exactly the same as with the CBDC, which means its value would be exactly the same as banknotes. It's a Canadian dollar, plain and simple. Okay,
that's great. Well, I want to thank you, Dinesh, and I want to thank you, Stephanie, for your excellent presentation and for all the questions you've answered. And I want to thank everyone who's participated tonight. I'm very heartened to see all the questions. I'm so disappointed we weren't able to get to every question. I know there were a lot of questions related to, how CBDC interacts with monetary policy. I've put a link in there in response to a question there. This is all areas that we're doing research on. So please visit our website if you want to follow more of our research. And as that research becomes available, we'll keep publishing it there. And one last request for everyone is if you can complete our survey and let us know what you thought of tonight's event. I've just put that in the chat as well. We very much welcome all your feedback. This really helps us determine sort of how to improve on our events for future talks and what kind of topics we can tackle in the future. So please take just a few minutes. It's a very short survey to fill that out. And finally, our next talk will be this fall, so please keep an eye on our website for more information. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Dinesh. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you to the Bank of Canada Museum team for organizing this amazing event. Wish you all a good night.